She earned $2,500 a week. Her father gave her $5. Her father gave her $5. She played women who lied beautifully, dangerous women. Knowing women. Women who smiled while the knife was already moving. Audiences believed every frame. What they did not know was that she had been rehearsing for those roles her entire life. Not on a set. At home. She won an Academy Award. She kept a diary that almost destroyed her. She survived 4 marriages, a plane crash, a custody battle, a public scandal so large that a sitting judge closed a courtroom to the press. And she raised 2 children through all of it. Here are 3 things that do not fit together. The most controlled performer in Hollywood could not control what was happening inside her own house. The woman who played the consummate liar wrote the most honest document of her life in a purple notebook, and it was used against her in open court. The mother, whose name is on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, raised a daughter who, in one interview, said something about her that no biography has properly recounted. One sentence. 40 years after the trial, 40 years after the Oscar, 40 years after all of it. Her name was Mary Astor. Her real name was Lucille Langhanke. The distance between those 2 names is the story of what her 2 children inherited and what they had to build entirely on their own. There is a sentence, her daughter said in one interview, decades after everything was over. It explains what the 2 children were really given. Close at 38 to 30. The Purple Diary. Everyone knows it existed. Almost no one knows what the judge said about it in private, or what happened to it afterward. Close at 21:30. Her father took something from her that $2,500 a week could not replace. 40 years later, her children were still paying for it. Close at 8:30. Stay until the end. The sentence her daughter said changes the shape of every other fact in this story. The year is 1920. She is 14 years old. She is standing in a Manhattan photographer's studio, and a man named Charles Albin is telling her that her eyes are remarkable. Her name is Lucille. Her father is Otto Ludwig Wilhelm Langhanke, a German immigrant who taught high school German in Quincy, Illinois, until the United States entered the First World War, and speaking German in a classroom became a professional liability. He had spent the years since then farming, moving the family to Chicago, moving them again to New York, always one step ahead of what was not working, always toward the next thing that might. The next thing was his daughter's face. In 1919, Lucille had entered a photograph into a beauty contest in Motion Picture magazine. She became a semi-finalist. The following year, she entered again. Runner-up. National contest. Her father noted the result with the precision of a man who understands that a face that can place second in a national competition is not a face, it is an asset. He moved the family to New York. He arranged meetings. He managed everything. He took a percentage of everything. Charles Albin's photographs of 14-year-old Lucille were seen by Harry Durant at Famous Players Lasky, the production company that would become Paramount Pictures. A contract followed. 6 months. Enough to establish that the asset was real. Then a conference happened among Jesse Lasky, who ran Paramount, Walter Wanger, a producer, and Luella Parsons, the most powerful gossip columnist in American film. They agreed on a name. Lucille Vasconcelos Langhanke would be known, from that point forward, as Mary Astor. How many decisions about your own life have been made in a room you were not invited into. She was 14 years old. Her name was taken from her in a conference among 3 adults who never asked her opinion. The name Mary Astor was assigned the way a brand name is assigned to a product with an eye toward what would move units, not what was true. The girl behind the name would spend the next decade trying to figure out which was which. She had a first screen test directed by Lillian Gish. What Gish said about her that day was documented. What it predicted about her career was accurate. What it said nothing about was what the career would cost. Close at 24 to 30. Her first screen test was directed by Lillian Gish. Gish was so impressed with the girl's Shakespeare recitation that she shot 1,000 feet of film with her on the spot. Paramount let the contract lapse anyway. It did not matter. Other studios noticed. The ascent was already underway. By 1923, the family had moved to Hollywood. By 1924, she was co-starring with John Barrymore in Beau Brummel at Warner Brothers, one of the biggest names in American film, opposite one of the fastest rising faces in it. She was 17 years old. Barrymore was 42. What followed, as documented in her autobiography, in court records, in the accounts of people who were present, was an affair conducted in the narrow spaces her parents allowed. Barrymore convinced the Langhankes that his acting lessons required privacy. That was the only mechanism available. Her parents had not moved the family to Hollywood to let a 42-year-old actor spend unsupervised time with their 17-year-old daughter. They had moved to Hollywood because the 17-year-old daughter was their income, and income required protection. The relationship ended. Barrymore moved on to another actress. Lucille Mary, the product, the asset, moved on to the next film, and the next, and the next. While her father managed the calendar and her mother managed the appearances, and neither of them asked what was actually happening inside their daughter. By 1925, she was earning $500 a week at Paramount, then $3,750 a week at Fox. At her peak, $2,500 a week, a salary that, in 1925, placed her among the highest-paid performers in the film industry. Her weekly allowance was $5. $5 against $2,500. That is 0.2%. With the remaining 99.8%, her father bought a Moorish mansion in the Hollywood Hills, an acre of land, ornate architecture, art glass windows, and a name, Moorcrest. They called it a family home. The legal record suggests it functioned more as a holding facility. She was 19 years old. She had been making films for 5 years. She had appeared in movies with the biggest names in American cinema. She had survived the transition from silent films to early talkies. She had, by any external measure, arrived. Inside Moorcrest, her father's physical and psychological abuse continued, with the consistency of someone who understood that the asset needed to be maintained but did not need to be respected. Her mother, who had always wanted to be an actress herself and had channeled that ambition entirely into her daughter, watched without intervening. One night, the precise date is not recorded, but she recounts it in her memoir with the clarity of an event that does not require a timestamp. Lucille Langhanke, 19 years old, and one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood, climbed out of the second-floor bedroom window of Moorcrest and escaped to a hotel. She left through the window because walking out the front door was not an option. Let that land for a moment. Second floor. Bedroom window. Hotel. She was 19. She had been working in films since she was 14. She had earned hundreds of thousands of dollars. She had the contractual power of a studio player, and the only way to leave her own house was through a window in the dark. A woman named Marie Astor, a theosophist, who had befriended the family and who understood the actual arithmetic of what was happening, negotiated her return. Otto Lang-Hanke, persuaded that a cooperative asset was more valuable than a contained one, opened a savings account for his daughter, with $500, 0.02% of her annual earnings, and granted her the freedom to come and go without her mother as chaperone. She did not gain full control of her own salary until she was 26 years old. When that day came, her parents sued her for financial support. She settled out of court. $100 a month. The people who had taken 95% of her earnings for a decade would receive, in recognition of that arrangement, $100 a month. She agreed. She needed it to be over. Her father took something from her that $2,500 a week could not replace. 40 years later, her children were still paying for it. What Otto Lang-Hanke took from his daughter was not money. The money was recoverable. What he took over 10 years of managed appearances and locked doors, and $5 allowances against $2,500 salaries, was the learned experience of what it feels like to be given unconditional care by a parent. She had never had it. She would spend the next 30 years attempting to give it to two people who were waiting for something she had never been shown how to provide. Jump ahead to 1987. Los Angeles. She is 81 years old, at the Motion Picture Country House in Woodland Hills, a retirement facility for former film workers. She has been there for years. Her children visit. Not often, but they visit. Her daughter Marilyn, by this point, has been married for decades. 4 children of her own. More than 30 grandchildren and great-grandchildren. A life built entirely away from the industry that defined her mother. In one interview given years before this, in a period when the interviewer expected either adoration or bitterness, Marilyn said one sentence about what it was like to grow up as Mary Astor's daughter. "We are going to get there." But first, the man who came immediately after the escape from the window. The man she married not because she loved him, but because she was breaking apart, and he was the doctor. The man she married first was named Kenneth Hawkes. He was a film director. He was the brother of Howard Hawks, who would go on to direct Scarface and The Big Sleep and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, a man who became one of the most significant directors in Hollywood history. Kenneth was the quieter one, the gentler one. The one whose career was still finding its shape. They married in February 1928. She was 21 years old. He was 29. Kenneth Hawkes was the first safe thing she had chosen entirely on her own. What she discovered inside that safety is the reason Marilyn came into the world the way she did. Close at 1530. By every external measure, it was a reasonable marriage. He was not her father. He did not manage her finances or restrict her movements or give her a $5 allowance against a $2,500 salary. He was stable. He was employed. He was, in the language of the era, a gentleman. He was also, by the documented account, not particularly interested in the physical dimensions of marriage. She became pregnant in July 1928. She did not have the child. The record here is blunt and does not require elaboration. She underwent an abortion. The year was 1928. The medical and legal context of that decision, in 1928, in California, should not pass without acknowledgement. It was not a simple administrative choice. It was a crisis managed in private, in a marriage that was already revealing itself to be something other than what she had hoped. They continued. She kept working. He kept directing. In 1929, he began work on a film called Such Men Are Dangerous, an aerial picture, filmed partly over the Pacific. To capture the flying sequences, 2 camera planes were needed. The cameras had to be in the air at the same time, shooting simultaneously, close enough to the subject to be useful. On the 2nd of January 1930, the 2 planes collided. 10 people died. Kenneth Hawkes was one of them. His body, along with 1 colleague, Max Gold, was recovered from the Pacific. The other 8 were not. The New York Times ran the story on the 3rd of January 1930. The headline identified him as husband of Mary Astor, the screen star. He was 31 years old. They had been married for less than 2 years. She was 23 years old, widowed, and the New York Times had introduced her to its readers not as an actress, not as a professional, not as a person with a name of her own, but as a wife. A designation. Her nervous breakdown began almost immediately. The collapse was not dramatic in the theatrical sense, it was the quieter kind, the kind that presents as exhaustion and then as something harder to name. She continued working because stopping was not financially available to her. She had her parents' lawsuit to manage, her own expenses, the next film, the next contract. Somewhere in this period, the exact timeline is not clean in the record, she developed a skin condition. A rash. Unexplained. Persistent. She went to see a doctor. His name was Franklin Thorpe. Mary Astor kept a second diary, not the purple one. She called it the baby diary. It tracked every week of Marilyn's first year of life. No biographer has spent much time on it. The purple one was more dramatic, but the baby diary is the one that tells you what she was actually trying to be. Close at 32 to 0. Dr. Franklin Thorpe was 13 years older than she was. He was 1 inch shorter than her 5'6" frame, which the documented record mentions with the specificity of a detail that is not accidental. He had practiced medicine in Los Angeles. He was, by the account of everyone who knew him in the professional context, competent. He was also, by the account of everyone who knew him in the personal context, something else. They married on the 29th of June 1931. By then, she had known him long enough to understand the pattern. By then, she had also been broken open by a year of grief and a nervous breakdown, and the permanent financial and legal pressure of her parents' lawsuit, and the ambient loneliness of being famous and 23 years old in a city that valued faces over people. She married the doctor. Have you ever made a decision that you understood, while you were making it, was not the right one, and made it anyway, because you were too tired to locate the energy for a better choice? The documentary record does not offer her internal state in this precise language. What it offers is a sequence of events that has a logic to it. If you follow the logic from the window escape at Moorcrest, to the rash, to the doctor, to the wedding. She was 24 years old when she married Franklin Thorpe. She had spent the previous decade being managed first by her father, then by studios, then by the contractual obligations of being a working actress in 1920s Hollywood. A doctor was someone who managed other people's problems. She had a great many problems. The arithmetic was not complicated. Thorpe essentially abandoned his medical practice after the marriage. They purchased a yacht. They went to sea. In June 1932, somewhere in the Pacific, they were sailing toward Hawaii when she went into labor. 2 months early. The baby was not supposed to arrive until August. The yacht was not a hospital. There was no surgical suite, no obstetric team, no neonatal equipment. What there was: open water, a doctor who was no longer practicing, and a woman who had been in early labor for long enough that both she and the child were in genuine danger. Both of them nearly died. The baby arrived. She survived. Mary survived. They named her Marilyn Hauoli Thorpe. Hauoli. In Hawaiian, it means joyful, happy, full of delight. The name was chosen in Honolulu, where they anchored after the birth. It is the kind of name you give a child when the fact of her survival feels like a specific gift, when the word for what you felt watching her breathe is a word in the language of the place where she first breathed safely. Kenneth Hawkes was the first safe thing she had chosen entirely on her own, what she discovered inside that safety. What the first safe choice had given her was the knowledge that safety and presence are not the same thing. Kenneth Hawkes had been safe. He had also been absent in the way that mattered most. What she had learned from that marriage, what his death had then sealed permanently into the record, was that she did not know how to choose for depth. She knew how to choose for relief. Thorpe was relief. Thorpe was someone who could handle things. What she had not yet understood was that a man who handles things as a profession does not stop handling them when he comes home. By 1933, both she and Thorpe were having affairs. This is documented. It is not editorial. Both parties, in the court record and in the personal record, are confirmed to have been involved with other people during this period of the marriage. The marriage had become, in her own words from the diary, words that Thorpe would later steal and weaponize, a series of explosions, usually over minor things. She needed to leave. She went to New York. It was May 1933. She had 2 weeks. A break in filming. Friends in the city. One of those friends knew a playwright. George S. Kaufman was not a movie star. He was not physically imposing. He was a tall man with a fear of germs and a remarkable head of hair. He was also one of the 2 or 3 most celebrated playwrights in America, a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner, a member of the Algonquin Round Table, a man whose wit had become so synonymous with New York intellectual life that meeting him, in certain circles, was something people mentioned for the rest of their lives. He was married to a woman named Beatrice Backrow, had been since 1917. The marriage was, by the agreement of both parties, open. They travelled separate roads and came back to each other. This arrangement was documented, understood, and functional. Kaufman was not leaving his wife. He had no intention of leaving his wife. None of that mattered. What mattered was, after a decade of her father's management, after Kenneth Hawkes' emotional distance, after Franklin Thorpe's volatility, she encountered a man who was funny, who was interested in ideas, who treated her as a person, rather than an asset or a patient or a problem to be contained. She was in New York for 2 weeks. She kept a diary. It was written in blue ledgers, in brown ink that the press would later describe, from a distance in a courtroom, as purple. The name stuck. The colour was wrong. The name was better than the truth, so the name is what survived. What was actually in the diary what the press invented and what was real, matters more than the scandal. Because the real excerpts tell you something specific about what she was looking for and why her children couldn't give it to her. Close at 24-0. In the diary, she wrote about Kaufman. She called him G. She wrote about his intelligence. She wrote about his wit. She wrote, in her own words, words that were released to the press by Thorpe's attorney on the 10th of August 1936, and are therefore part of the verified court record that she was still in a haze, a nice rosy glow. That it was beautiful, glorious, that she hoped it was her last love. That she could not top it with anything in her experience. She also wrote, and this entry is the one Thorpe found first, the one that landed before the Kaufman passages, the one that told him the shape of what he was dealing with about Thorpe himself. I feel sorry for him because I made him marry me. I play a kind of game with him. That sentence. In her own handwriting. In a drawer in their house. Thorpe found the diary. He read every word. There is a version of this story where what follows is a scandal. A Hollywood gossip item. A custody trial that newspapers covered the way they cover a sporting event, with vendors selling hot dogs and ice cream outside the courthouse, with crowds flooding the hallways, with headline writers competing for the most theatrical description of the diary's alleged contents. That version is not wrong, it is just incomplete. What followed was not primarily a scandal. What followed was a man who understood that he was holding something with which he could extract anything he wanted, and who then stood at the bedside of a sick woman and used it. She caught the flu. This is in the documented record not as a medical detail but as a tactical one. Thorpe knew she was sick. He waited until she was sick. He stood at her bedside. He told her what he had found. He told her what it proved. He told her that if she did not agree to his terms, he would release the diaries to the press. He would, in the words documented by author Joseph Egan, blacken her name and the names of her friends on the front pages of every newspaper in America. His terms were not modest. He wanted sole custody of Marilyn. He wanted half of her house. He wanted control of her finances. She was a woman who had spent her entire professional life having her finances controlled by someone else. Her father had done it for a decade. Thorpe had been doing it inside the marriage. Now, from a sickbed, she was being asked to formalize the arrangement in exchange for the private contents of her own diary not being printed in every newspaper on the continent. She was 27 years old. She was sick. She was alone in the room with a man who was 13 years her senior and had already demonstrated across 4 years of marriage that he understood how to apply pressure at the correct moment. She signed. The settlement was filed in April 1935. Franklin Thorpe received sole custody of Marilyn, who was at this point 2 years old. Mary could visit at will. She could have the child for 6 months of the year if she wished. That phrase, if she wished. She had nearly died bringing this child into the world on a yacht in the Pacific. She had named her Howley Joyful, full of delight in the language of the island where they finally stopped sailing. She had kept a separate diary, a private one, that tracked every week of Marilyn's first year of life, her development, her sounds, her weight, her first responses to the world. That diary is not the famous one. Nobody writes books about it. It does not have a colour associated with it. But it exists. And what it documents is a woman who was trying, in the only private space available to her, to record what it felt like to be a mother, to do for her child what had never been done for her. And then she signed a piece of paper, sick and cornered and alone, that gave that child to the man who had stood at her bedside with the evidence and waited. The studio heads got word of the diary's contents before the ink was dry on the settlement. Sam Goldwyn, Jack Warner, Irving Thalberg, Louis B. Mayer, Jesse Lasky, the same man who had given her the name Mary Astor, in a room she had not been invited into. They sent lawyers. They told her it would be better for the industry and for her not to fight. She had already signed. There was nothing left to fight about. For 15 months after the divorce, Thorpe continued to use the diary as leverage. Every disagreement, every schedule conflict, every time she wanted more time with Marilyn. The diary was the instrument, and he played it whenever the situation required. Finally, she had enough. What was actually in the diary, what the press invented, and what was real? Here is what was real. 2 verified excerpts, released by Thorpe's own attorney to the press on the 10th of August, 1936, because they were the strongest ammunition available. The scorecard, the alleged list of Hollywood actors ranked by performance in bed, was a fabrication. Joseph Egan, who spent years researching the trial, confirmed it. A salacious forgery, likely created by someone who feared their name might appear in the real diary and wanted to frighten her into settling. It was printed everywhere. It became the legend. The legend was more interesting than the truth. The truth was 2 excerpts from the genuine diary. One about her feelings for Kaufman, and one about her feelings for the man who was now standing outside the courtroom. The press sold hot dogs and ice cream. The crowds came. The headline writers competed. And a 2-year-old girl named Marilyn Hawley Thorpe, named for joy, named for the relief of surviving, went home with her father. Now here is what I want you to hold. It is the 29th of July, 1936. The custody trial is about to begin. She has been living with the signed settlement for 15 months. Thorpe has continued threatening. The lawyers have filed. The courtroom is overflowing. Vendors outside are selling food. She is also, at this exact moment, filming a movie. The judge, his name was Goodwin J. Knight, and he would later become governor of California, decided that because she was in production on Dodsworth, there would be no continuance. The trial would be held at night, starting at 7 p.m. every evening. She would spend each day being directed in front of a camera. She would spend each evening being cross-examined in front of a judge. The man playing the opposing attorney's role, the man who called her an unfit mother, who announced the diary would split the movie industry wide open, had a specific theory about what kind of woman writes things down. George Kaufman, when he received a subpoena to testify, was smuggled off to Catalina Island on Irving Thalberg's yacht. When the judge issued a bench warrant for his arrest, he was hidden at Moss Hart's home in Los Angeles and then transported to the San Bernardino train station inside a laundry basket. A Pulitzer Prize winner. In a laundry basket. Running from a custody trial he had not caused, but had certainly complicated. The diary was examined by the judge in private. Pages were missing. Thorpe had removed them to make photocopies. A mutilated document is not admissible as evidence. The judge ruled accordingly. What happened next changed everything. It ended without a verdict. That is the part the newspapers covered least carefully because a settlement is not a story. A settlement does not have a winning side. It does not have a moment where a judge points at someone and says the word that every crowd outside a courthouse came to hear. What Judge Goodwin J. Knight did was simpler and more final. He called a halt. He had watched the proceedings for 3 weeks. He had watched Thorpe's attorney announce that the diary would split the movie industry wide open, and then watched the diary itself be ruled inadmissible because Thorpe had taken it apart to make photocopies, which made it a mutilated document, which made it inadmissible as evidence. He had watched Kaufman disappear into a laundry basket and then reappear in a San Bernardino train station. He had watched Thorpe's own mistress, a woman the nursemaid described as Norma the flashy blonde, come to light when Norma herself stabbed Thorpe during a domestic dispute and the police were called. He had watched Thorpe deny any extramarital activity and then be confronted with a card from one of his lovers reading, "How deeply do I love you, sweetheart." He had watched all of this unfold at 7 o'clock in the evening, night after night, in a room so full of press and spectators that the trial had to be moved to larger quarters. He told them to settle it. They spent 3 days working out the terms. At the end of those 3 days, they had agreed shared custody of Marilyn. This is what most accounts of the Mary Astor scandal fail to mention. She won. Not theatrically. Not in the manner of a press headline or a crowd chanting on courthouse steps. But she went into that courtroom with Thorpe holding a stolen diary and a blackmail settlement and the aligned pressure of every major studio head in Hollywood, and she came out of it with her daughter. Half the year, every year, until Marilyn was old enough to decide for herself. The diary was sealed by court order, placed in a bank vault, to be held there in case the custody case was ever reopened. It sat in that vault for approximately 16 years. The purple diary, what the judge said about it in private, what happened to it afterward. When Marilyn came of age, both parents agreed on what to do with it. There was a brief discussion. It was not hostile, by the documented account. Two people who had despised each other in a courtroom in 1936 made one decision together in the early 1950s, without argument: the diary should be destroyed. A court officer took it from the vault and incinerated it. The document that Thorpe had used to stand at her bedside and extract a signature from a sick woman, the document the press had turned into a mythology of scorecards and purple ink, and Hollywood scandal was reduced to ash, without ceremony, in a room that no vendor was selling hot dogs outside of. George Kaufman, when he heard the diary had been burned, said nothing publicly. He had said nothing publicly about any of it. Some silences are the most honest available response. She went back to work. Here is what Lillian Gish's screen test predicted. That the girl standing in front of her camera in 1921, reciting Shakespeare without prompting, had something in her that most actresses do not develop in a full career. A quality of presence. An ability to occupy a role so completely that the role becomes credible before a single word has been processed by the audience. Here is what it could not predict. That 30 years later, the role she would win an Academy Award for would be a concert pianist. Her father had forced her to practice piano in their house in Quincy, Illinois, from the age of 7. He stood in the next room. He told her she had no life in her playing. The lessons were an ordeal. She had climbed a second-floor window to escape his management. She had spent her professional life in constant negotiation with men who believed they understood what she was worth better than she did. In 1941, she sat down at a piano on a Warner Brothers soundstage and played Tchaikovsky. Not a stand-in. not a studio musician whose hands were cut to in close-up. She played it herself. She had practiced for months. The same hands that had once been criticized for having no life in them played, under the direction of Edmund Goulding, with enough technical credibility that no one in the audience questioned whether Sandra Kovac was a real concert pianist. Sandra Kovac was a woman who used people, who was brilliant and selfish and charming and ultimately isolated by the choices those qualities required. The screenplay gave her a ruin that felt inevitable. Mary Astor played her with such precision that the Academy gave her the Oscar. She was 34 years old. She had been working in film for 20 years. She had survived her parents and Kenneth Hawkes and Franklin Thorpe and the diary and the studio pressure and the custody trial. She was currently married to a Mexican film editor named Manuel del Campo, and they were, in the quiet way of a marriage that has already found its ceiling, drifting. Later that same year, 1941, she appeared in The Maltese Falcon. She played Bridget O'Shaughnessy, a woman who lies beautifully, who smiles while the knife is already moving, who convinces every person in every room that she is exactly what they need her to be until the moment she doesn't need them anymore. The press noted the irony. They always note the irony. What they noted less carefully was this. She had spent 20 years watching other people construct the narrative of who she was. Her father, the studios, Thorpe's attorneys, the headline writers competing for the most theatrical description of a diary they had mostly fabricated. She had never played the villain before. When she finally did, she played her from the inside out. She had married Manuel del Campo sometime around late 1936, in the quiet interval between the custody trial and the rest of her life. He was a film editor, Mexican. Handsome, by all accounts his son would grow up to look just like him, only taller and in better shape, in the words of the person who knew them both. The marriage lasted 5 years. When the Second World War began, Manuel enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force. He went overseas. The distance between Hollywood and active military service is not a distance that most marriages survive, not because of infidelity or anger, but because of the simpler arithmetic of absence. Two people who were already not close enough became further apart until apart became the permanent condition. They divorced in 1941. Before they did, she had a son. Anthony Del Campo put himself through college, got a zoology degree, worked the night shift at a drive-in restaurant to do it, joined the Navy, went to Japan, and stayed married for 50 years. Mary Astor's name is on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Her son is on Find a Grave. What he built entirely on his own is the part this story almost forgot to tell. Close at 40-0. Anthony Paul Del Campo, called Tono, always, by everyone who knew him, was born on the 5th of June 1939. 5 weeks early, in Los Angeles. Not on a yacht, not in Honolulu. In a hospital, in a city, in the ordinary way that second children sometimes arrive before the world is quite ready. He was 7 years younger than Marilyn. His half-sister, who was 6 years old when he was born, and 7 when he first looked up at her from wherever babies look from. It would describe him decades later with the particular warmth of someone who has decided to love a person cleanly and without conditions. I adored my brother. He was a wonderful brother, brilliant, smart kid with a lot of moxie. Mary Astor had 2 children. One was named for Joy in Hawaiian, born on a yacht in the Pacific, who grew up largely in the custody of the man who had blackmailed her mother into signing a settlement while sick with flu. The other arrived 5 weeks early in Los Angeles, grew up between a film set mother and a father who had gone overseas, put himself through Los Angeles College on his own earnings from the night shift at a drive-in restaurant, got a degree in zoology, joined the Navy, sat behind a desk in Japan for 2 years, and came home to build an ordinary life with the same thoroughness he'd applied to everything else. He married in 1963. Stayed married for nearly 50 years. He died in May of 2014. He was 74 years old. His mother had died in 1987. She never saw the end of the marriage he built. But she lived long enough to see him start it. 2 children, both born early, both into the wreckage of a marriage that was already ending. Both grew up entirely outside the industry that defined her. Neither of them made headlines. Neither of them was named on a marquee. Marilyn named her daughter Frances. Tono got a zoology degree. They were, in the language of people who understand what that means, fine. They were fine. There is a word her daughter used in an interview that no biographer has centered. It is not tragic, it is not difficult, it is a quieter word than either of those. It is the word you use when you have thought carefully about something for a long time. Close at 39 to 30. She married Thomas Gordon Wheelock on the 24th of December, 1945. Christmas Eve. She was 39 years old. He was a stockbroker, wealthy, stable, the kind of man who operates entirely within structures that other people find reassuring. He was not in the film industry. He had no diary to steal and no leverage to apply. He also, by the account of those who observed the marriage closely, had no real mechanism for reaching the person who had survived everything she had survived. They lasted, on paper, until 1955. In practice, they had separated years before the divorce was filed. 4 husbands. Let me give you the complete arithmetic, because it matters to what comes next. Kenneth Hawkes. A safe choice that ended in a plane crash. He had been 31, she had been 23. She had already had an abortion in that marriage and already understood that safety and presence are not the same thing. Franklin Thorpe. A man who knew how to manage things. He managed her into a settlement while she was sick in bed. Manuel del Campo. 5 years. A son born 5 weeks early, and a war that provided the exit strategy. Thomas Wheelock. A wealthy stockbroker who could not reach her. She had spent her entire adult life looking for what her father had made. It's structurally impossible to receive unconditional presence from a person who was not extracting something from her. She had looked for it in 4 marriages and across decades of professional achievement, and she had not found it, not in the form she needed it, because what her father had taken from her could not be located in another person. It had to be located inside herself. She had not yet found a way to do that. In 1949, she walked into a sanitarium for alcoholics. She had been drinking for approximately 20 years. She had managed it across the studio years with the same discipline that had allowed her to film in costume by day and testify under oath at night. But the studio years were ending. The roles were getting smaller. The contracts were getting shorter. The structure that had held everything together, the call sheet, the lighting marks, the director's cut, was contracting around her. Without it, the 20 years of managed drinking became unmanageable. Inside the sanitarium, without the name Mary Astor, without the Oscar on the shelf, without the diary mythology, without the 4 marriages and the custody trial and the newspaper headlines, She was Lucille Langhanke. The girl from Quincy, Illinois, who had told her father at age 12 exactly what she wanted. To go to high school, then maybe to Gem City Business College, then to work a little, then to get married and have children. He had lectured her with a fury she documented in her memoir, with the precision of someone who never forgot a single word of it. She had spent the next 50 years doing everything except that. The sanitarium had no marquee. Nobody sold hot dogs outside it. No headline writer competed for the best description of what it looked like inside. It was just a room. And inside it, finally, was the silence she had been outrunning since 1920. She converted to Roman Catholicism in 1951, the same year of the overdose. She wrote 2 memoirs. She lived in the motion picture country house for her final years, near her son. There is a specific sentence she wrote about her children in my story, not a sentimental sentence, not a guilty sentence, an honest one. It tells you exactly what she understood, in the end, about what she had and had not given them. Close at 40 to 30. It was May 1951. She had been sober for stretches. She had also been drinking for 20 years. Sobriety, for a person whose drinking is functional, whose drinking is the load-bearing wall of a personality that was never allowed to develop any other structural support, does not arrive cleanly. It arrives in intervals, surrounded by the thing it is trying to replace. That night, in May, there was vodka. There were sleeping pills. Whether the combination was accidental as she maintained or deliberate as the police classified it, citing it as her 3rd overdose in 2 years, is a question the documented record does not resolve cleanly. The police filed it one way, she described it another. The New York Times ran it on page 40. Mary Astor is saved by priest after overdose of pills. The priest was Father Augustine O'Dea. She had first encountered him not in a confessional, not in a crisis, but at a Palm Springs retreat, the weekend home of her son Tono's Catholic godparents. Tono, born in 1939, had been baptized Catholic. She had arranged that without fully understanding why, except that it felt correct in a way she could not yet articulate. His godparents introduced her to the faith. She began asking questions, the kind of questions a person asks when every other available framework has already been tested and found insufficient. Father O'Dea told her that faith was a gift she had to ask for. He told her to stay calm. He told her to pray. She prayed the rosary. She began a novena to Street Thérèse of Lisieux. And then, in her own words documented in Oasis, conversion stories of Hollywood legends, drawn from her personal writing, something happened that she described as an actual physical sensation. Light. And then her knees on the floor. There was one concept, of all the concepts in the Catholic tradition, that hit her with the force of something she had been searching for since 1920. God as a loving father. She had been given a father who took her earnings and gave her $5. A father who stood in the next room while she practiced piano and told her she had no life in her playing. A father who gave her a name, a product name, a brand in a meeting she was not invited to attend. She had spent 61 years in a world built by that father. And here, in a framework she had come to through her son's baptism and a Palm Springs weekend and a priest who told her to be calm, was the idea that the thing she had been looking for had always been available and had never required a negotiation and could not be taken from her by a court order or a custody settlement or a divorce filed in Los Angeles in 1935. She was not a person who used language carelessly. She was a woman who had kept diaries, who had written novels, who would go on to write 2 memoirs. When she wrote about this moment, she did not call it a revelation in the theatrical sense. She called it in her own words about Street Therese' phrase, "Jesus Christ is God," words that made me slip to my knees in prayer. Slip. Not fall. Not collapse. Slip the way you move when the ground finally holds. She converted to Roman Catholicism in 1951. She was 45 years old. Anthony Paul del Campo Tono grew up without a Hollywood career. He did not grow up without a work ethic. His mother was one of the most recognizable faces in American cinema. His father was a film editor who went overseas and came back to a marriage that had already ended. The industry that had defined both his parents had not been extended to him as an inheritance, and he did not seek it. He put himself through Los Angeles College. He worked the night shift at a drive-in restaurant to pay for it a fry cook, in the early hours, while other people in Los Angeles were going home from parties his mother had stopped attending. He got a degree in zoology. He joined the Navy. He went to Japan. He sat behind a desk for 2 years, by his own description not a glamorous deployment, not a heroic posting. A desk. In Japan. For 2 years. After which he came home and built a life with the precision of someone who had decided, at some point, that precision was what he had. He married in 1963. He stayed married for nearly 50 years. He died in May of 2014. He was 74 years old. His half-sister Marilyn, 7 years his senior, described him in the only terms that matter in a relationship between siblings. "I adored my brother. He was a wonderful brother, brilliant, smart kid, with a lot of moxie. Tono will always be my little brother." He was born 5 weeks early in a Los Angeles hospital. He outlived his mother by 27 years. He was never on a marquee. He left a 50-year marriage and a zoology degree. That is the entirety of the record, and it is a complete record. Here is what the baby diary reveals. Not its contents, those are private, held in the Mary Astor archive at Boston University alongside her memoir drafts and her correspondence. What it reveals is not a specific entry. What it reveals is the fact of its existence. Mary Astor kept a diary about a custody trial. Everyone knows that diary. It has a colour associated with it that is not even the correct colour. She also kept a diary about her daughter's first year of life. Week by week. Development by development. The sounds Marilyn made. The weight she gained. The first responses to the world. Nobody stood at her bedside and threatened to release that diary. Nobody photocopied it and used it as leverage. Nobody gave it a nickname or sold hot dogs outside a courthouse because of its contents. She kept it because she wanted to, in the only private space she had. Recording what it felt like to be a mother to do for Marilyn, day by day, what Otto Langhanke had never done for Lucille. She had never been taught how to do it. The baby diary is evidence that she was trying to teach herself. That is what it reveals. There is a concept in her conversion record, not a spiritual concept, a practical one, the kind of thing a person realizes after every other available framework has failed. It explains why she wrote the memoir. Close at 42 to 45. In 1959, she published My Story, an autobiography. She wrote it on the advice of her therapist. She had been in therapy, a process that, for a woman who had spent her entire professional life being managed by other people's interpretations of who she was, must have had a particular texture. Someone asking questions, her answering them. No studio head in the room, no attorney, no headline writer competing for the most theatrical description. She answered honestly. And then, on her therapist's advice, she published the answers. The memoir was a bestseller. It chronicles, in her own words, the parents, the marriages, the alcoholism, the diary, the trial. It names the people. It does not protect reputations, not even her own. It does not frame her as a victim or as a heroine. It frames her as a person who made choices, understood some of them too late, and wanted the record to be accurate. Here is the practical realization. She had spent 40 years having other people write her story. Her father had written it in a conference room. She was not invited to Mary Astor, a name chosen for market value. Thorpe's attorney had written it on the front pages of newspapers in August 1936. The headline writers had written it with their colourful language and their fabricated scorecards. She sat down in 1959, at age 53, and wrote it herself. That is the conversion that preceded the religious one, and it required the same thing. The decision to stop letting other people's frameworks be the only available structures. She also wrote A Life on Film in 1971, a professional memoir focused on the work. She is, in that book, characteristically precise about craft and characteristically restrained about everything else. By the time she finished both books, she had done what her father had prevented her from doing at age 12. She had told the truth, in her own words, and put her name on it. Not the product name, the writer's name. Both books are credited to Mary Astor. But she wrote them as Lucille. There is one thing Marilyn said about growing up as Mary Astor's daughter that no biography centers, because it is not dramatic. It is the opposite of dramatic. It is the detail that tells you what Mary Astor understood, in the end, about the difference between what was done to her and what she was capable of choosing not to do. Close at 43 to 45. Marilyn Howerly Thorpe Rowe was married for 57 years. She had 4 children, more than 30 grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She lives in Utah. She was never on a studio lot in a professional capacity. She never signed with a talent agency. She never appeared in a film. In the 2010 interview with Farron Smith Name, the self-styled siren, one of the most respected classic film writers of the last 20 years, Marilyn said something that sits next to the more dramatic parts of her account without being noticed. She was never pressured by her mother to go into show business. Let the arithmetic run in reverse for a moment. Otto Langhanke saw his daughter's photograph in Motion Picture magazine and decided, with the precision of a man who understood assets, that her face was his future. He moved the family to New York. He moved them to Hollywood. He managed every contract, every appearance, every dollar. He gave her a $5 weekly allowance against a $2,500 weekly salary and called it a family arrangement. He sued her for financial support when she finally broke free. His daughter, who had been removed from school at 14, whose name had been assigned to her in a meeting, whose window had been the only available exit, raised a daughter of her own. And did not push her toward a camera. Did not manage her appearances. Did not take a percentage. Did not decide, when she looked at her daughter's face, that it was an asset. That is not a small thing. That is, in the specific context of what had been done to Mary Astor, an enormous thing. It is the proof that somewhere inside the 4 marriages and the custody trial and the alcoholism and the sanitarium and the overdose and the conversion, somewhere inside all of it, she had understood the mechanism clearly, enough to choose not to repeat it. She broke one chain. Not all of them, but one. Here is the question nobody ever asked about Mary Astor. What did she want? Not what her father wanted. Not what the studios wanted. Not what Franklin Thorpe wanted, or what the headline writers thought would sell papers. What did she want? She answered this question once, at age 12, in Quincy, Illinois. She told her father, with the directness of a child who does not yet understand that honesty is dangerous in certain rooms. She wanted to finish high school, then maybe Gem City Business College, then work a little, then get married and have children. He called her a good-for-nothing. He moved the family to New York the following year. She spent the next 60 years making films, signing contracts, surviving marriages, sitting in courtrooms, winning an Oscar, checking into a sanitarium, converting to a new faith, writing 2 memoirs, and watching from the motion picture country house in Woodland Hills, as her children built, in their ordinary and particular ways, the exact lives she had described to her father at age 12. Marilyn married. She had 4 children. She raised them in Utah, away from cameras. 57 years of the same marriage. Tono worked. He studied. He got a degree that had nothing to do with entertainment. He married. He stayed married for 50 years. 2 children. Between them, over a century of combined marriage. Grandchildren. Great-grandchildren. Degrees and desk jobs and ordinary days in ordinary places. The thing she wanted at age 12 and was called a good-for-nothing for wanting. She did not get it for herself. The window had closed on that version of her life in 1920, when a man named Charles Albin photographed a 14-year-old with remarkable eyes, and her father noted the result with the precision of a man who understood returns on investment. But it did not close entirely. It opened again, in a different shape, through 2 people who were born early, one on a yacht in the Pacific, one in a Los Angeles hospital, and who grew up largely outside the industry that formed her, and who built, without being pushed toward it, the ordinary life she had described in a room in Quincy, Illinois, to a man who told her she was wrong to want it. She was not wrong. She was just 60 years early. In 2010, a woman named Farron Smith Neme, a film writer the blogosphere knows as the self-styled Siren, opened her email and found a message from one Marilyn Rowe of Utah. Subject line, Mary Astor. Marilyn had found Neme's writing about her mother. She wanted to talk. The conversation that followed became one of the most quietly devastating profiles in classic Hollywood writing, because Marilyn did not perform grief, and she did not perform adoration, and she did not perform resentment. She said exactly what was true. In her own words. The way her mother had taught her through the example of a memoir written at 53 that did not protect anyone's reputation, including her own. Here is what Marilyn said about growing up as Mary Astor's daughter. I loved my mother, but was usually scared of her. I never won. She was always right. I was always Mary Astor's daughter, which in a way was a burden, being only recognized as such. I was her Shadow for years, not good. That is the sentence. Not tragic. Not bitter. Not the kind of sentence that makes headlines or sells papers or gets associated with a colour it doesn't actually have. The word she used is scared. Not wounded. Not angry. Not abandoned. Scared. It is the quietest word available for the distance that existed between a woman who had never been given unconditional presence by a parent and a daughter who loved her and could not reach her through it. Scared is the word you use when you have thought carefully about something for a long time and arrived at the most accurate description, and the most accurate description is not the most dramatic one. Marilyn also said this in a separate interview to Joseph Egan, the researcher who spent years on the custody trial. She did the best she could with the choices she made. She deserves all the honor possible to give her because she did so much with her life. 2 sentences. Different interviews. Different years. Same woman. One describes the experience of being her daughter. One describes the conclusion she reached about her mother. A person who says I was scared of her and then says she deserves all the honor possible is not being inconsistent. They are being completely honest. They are holding 2 things at once, the cost and the achievement, without requiring either one to cancel the other. Her mother had wanted that quality more than anything. The ability to hold contradictions without collapsing them into a single, cleaner story. Marilyn learned it. She learned it despite and perhaps because of everything. Mary Astor died on the 25th of September, 1987. She was 81 years old. The cause was respiratory failure due to pulmonary emphysema. She had been at the Motion Picture Country House in Woodland Hills for her final years, a facility built to house former film workers who could no longer care for themselves, funded by the industry that had named her in a conference she had not been invited to attend. She is buried at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, California. Her name on the headstone is Mary Astor. Her name on her birth certificate was Lucille Vasconcellos Lang Hankey. She has a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Her daughter lives in Utah. Her son died in May 2014, 50 years into a marriage he stayed in. Between the 2 of them, across their combined lifetimes, they produced more than 30 grandchildren and great-grandchildren who have no reason to know what a custody trial is and never will. Here is what the secret fate of her 2 children was. Ordinary. Completely, deliberately, stubbornly ordinary. In the specific context of what their mother had survived, to give them the chance to be ordinary was the highest possible achievement. The name they were given at birth was Mary Astor's children. The lives they built were entirely their own.